Good afternoon and good morning from me as well. As Joe just introduced, I'm Julia Metz. I'm Director of Agora Industry, and I have the pleasure to moderate today's webinar on current trends on China's climate and energy transition together with Joe. And as you will see, the industry sector actually plays a crucial role in this analysis and the findings, but more about this in a few minutes, because now I'm happy to introduce you to my colleague, Professor Kevin Tu. Hello, Kevin. Kevin is Managing Director of Agora Energy China and has more than 2 decades of experience in the energy and environmental fields. And Kevin will now provide our analysis of China's climate and energy transformation 2025 with an overview of the 10 key trends that we identified in this analysis. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Julia, for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's launch event. I am very pleased to present Agora's 2026 China Energy Transition and Climate Status Report. This report looks at 10 trends shaping China's energy and climate pathways as the country entered the 15th five-year plan period. The central message is that China's energy transition is entering a new phase. The question is no longer only how fast China can build clean energy capacity. It is increasingly whether that clean energy can be integrated into industry, markets, infrastructure, and governance to deliver sustained emissions reductions, strengthen energy security, and support industry transformation. I will structure today's talk in 4 parts. First, I will assess China's current energy transition status. Second, discuss energy security and system integration. Third, look at industry transformation. Finally, I will turn to the 15th five-year plan outlook and the shift from energy control towards carbon governance. Before looking at the detailed trends, it is useful to start with the global implications. China's transition matters because it sits at the intersection of climate, industry, energy security, and trade. Climate action in China is increasingly also an industry growth strategy, visible in electrical vehicles, batteries, solar, and wind. China's scale also offers lessons for system integration because integrating very large share of renewable energy is now a global challenge. At the same time, energy security anxieties are shaping the transition as much as climate ambition. This can accelerate clean energy investments, but it can also reinforce fossil fuel alternatives such as coal chemicals. The international message is therefore balanced. China's scale creates opportunities for cooperations in hard-to-electrify sectors, but trade tensions and geopolitical fragmentations should not undermine climate progress. Let me start with China's energy transition status at a glance. China's global role has changed drastically since the country joined the WTO in 2001. It now accounts for a very large share of global energy demand, power generation, carbon emissions, and industrial production. Meanwhile, China has become the leading global deployer and manufacturers of clean technologies, including solar PV, wind power, batteries, and electrical vehicles. This dual role is essential for understanding the report. China is not only the world's largest emitters, it is also the largest clean energy investor and deployer. Recent growth is moderating and gradually shifting towards lower carbon and higher value sectors, but the industry base remains very large. This creates a crossroads. China has already shown that clean technology can scale rapidly. The harder, more difficult question is whether this scale can now reshape the wider economy and reduce emissions structurally. Our analysis shows that China's emissions are approaching a structural high-level plateau. In 2025, carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel combustions and industrial process emissions rose by around 0.5% year-over-year. This is not a sustained decline, and we should be cautious about declining a definitive emissions peak. But the direction of travel is important. Emission growth has slowed markedly compared with previous development cycles. If 2025 was the peak year, China would still need average annual reduction of around 0.7 to 1% to reduce emissions 7 to 10% below peak levels by 2035. A prolonged plateau would therefore increase the costs and difficulties of meeting longer-term climate objectives. The practical implication is clear. The 15th Five-Year Plan needs to turn clean energy expansion into actual fossil fuel substitution. That requires grid flexibility, demand-side response, industry electrification, and stronger carbon governance. One important reason emissions growth has slowed is the changing role of coal power. Coal-fired generation declined last year, and coal's share of power generation fell to slightly over 50%, down from 57% in 2020. This suggests clean electricity is beginning to constrain coal generation growth, but the story is not straightforward. Coal capacity continues to expand, reflecting reliability concerns, peak demand, extreme weather, and periods of low renewable output. The key question during the 15th Five-Year Plan is therefore not only how much coal capacity exists, but how it operates. Coal should increasingly provide flexibility and reliability service with lower utilization, while storage, grids, and demand-side resources reduce the need for future coal dependence. This slide shows why power sector progress alone is not sufficient. In 2025, coal power, crude steel, and construction materials contributed to emissions moderation. However, weak real estate demand reduced steel and cement outcome, but coal-fired power generation declined. But this reduction was partially offset by growth in coking gas power, chemicals, and other industry sectors. In other words, emissions growth is moving from traditional construction-linked sectors towards chemical, non-ferrous metals, and parts of heavy industry. This is one of the most important findings of this report. China's transition is increasingly an industry transformation story. The next phase depends on whether clean electricity, low carbon feedstock, hydrogen, and material circularities can be integrated into industrial production. National emissions trends also hide significant provincial divergence. At the national level, China is approaching a plateau, but several coal-producing and coast industry provinces still witnessed emissions growth above 1% last year. This means national progress is being driven by reduction elsewhere in the system, while some major energy-intensive provinces remain on a growth pathway. This matters because China's national targets are implemented through province, coal-producing region, coast manufacturing province, and renewable power province will be critical to achieve the national carbon peak goal. Stronger provincial carbon accounting, monitoring, and enforcement are therefore not technical details. They are central to China's climate strategy. So if we look at where China stands, looking back, the 14th five-year plan laid a solid foundation for the next phase of the transition. The dual carbon goal became more deeply embedded in energy industry and regional policy making. Energy security became a stronger constraint after COVID-19, global fossil fuel volatilities, and power shortages. Renewable and electrification became key growth drivers. Meanwhile, emissions moved towards a high-level plateau, while coal shifted increasingly from baseload generation towards flexibility and system balancing. The 14th five-year plan also exposed the next challenge: steel, chemical, and cement are now central to the remaining emissions problem. In short, the 14th five-year plan was about building the foundation. The 15th five-year plan will test implementation. Let me now turn to energy security and system integration. Energy security concerns remain a powerful policy drivers of Chinese energy policy. China's oil imports dependence rose above 70% last year, and fossil fuel import exposure through the Middle East remain a structural risk. When international oil prices rise, coal to olefins and other coal chemical routes became more economically attractive. From a short-term energy security perspective, the logic is understandable. Domestic coal appear to offer an alternative to imported oil-based feedstock, but from a longer-term climate and industry perspective, rapid coal chemical expansion creates risk. It can increase emissions, intensify overcapacity, and create carbon lock-in. The strategic answer should not be fossil self-sufficiency at any cost. It should be reducing fossil dependence through electrification, cleaner feedstock, renewable hydrogen, material circularity, and more integrated domestic clean energy system. China's renewable growth remains remarkable. Solar PV and wind rose to 22.1% of power generation mix last year, and solar capacity is expected to overtake coal capacity this year. But the next challenge is changing. Installed capacity alone no longer tells the full story. The more important question is how much clean electricity is consumed, how reliably it is delivered, and how much fossil generation is displaced. Distributed renewables are reshaping distribution grids, while large renewable bases are often far from demand centers. This is why policy attention is shifting from capacity targets towards system performance and grid value, storage transmission market reform, and local flexibility will determine whether renewable growth becomes emissions reduction. New electricity demand is becoming an important part of the transition. Electrical vehicle, data center, and broad electrification are increasing electricity consumption. This means that some new renewable generation is meeting incremental demand rather than directly displacing fossil generation. That creates pressure on emissions, but it also creates an opportunity. EVs and data centers can become flexibility resource through smart charging, vehicle-to-grid services, demand response, and load management. Early deployment is already visible. The key message is that demand growth must become system active. Flexibility is essential for turning renewable expansion into sustained emissions reduction. AI-driven computing demand is often discussed only as a new energy burden in China. It can also become a source of stable, large-scale demand for renewable electricity if planned well. New national computing hubs are required to source high share of renewable electricity. The East Data West computing strategy aims to move suitable computing workloads towards renewable-rich regions, while keeping latency-sensitive demand closer to eastern node centers. This helps address a structural mismatch. Electricity demand is concentrated in eastern China, while renewable resources are stronger in the west and north. The opportunity is to use data center siting as a system planning tool, but this requires credible clean power procurement, grid integration, and carbon accounting. China's energy geography is also changing. Many coal-producing regions are becoming the country's largest renewable energy hubs. This creates an important opportunity to transform traditional fossil energy bases into centers for clean power, flexibility, and low-carbon industry. But the same slide shows the bottleneck. Wind and solar utilization rates fell below 95% last year, the lowest level during the 15th five-year plan period. This does not mean China should slow renewable deployment. It means system integration must catch up. The next phase will depend on transmission, storage, market integration, and demand creation. Coal regions can become strategic renewable hubs, but only if clean energy supply is effectively connected with demand. This brings us to industry transformation. Industry is now entering a harder phase of decarbonization. Direct coal use as fuel has declined in some industry applications, while electricity consumption has increased. But coal used as feedstock and process emissions continue to grow in important sectors. Steel, chemicals, and non-ferrous metals are now major sources of remaining emissions pressure. The key point is that industry decarbonization cannot be separated from power system reform. Electrification, renewable hydrogen, and material circularities all depend on abundant low-carbon city and a flexible grid. Without a decarbonized power system, industrial electrification will not deliver its full emissions benefit. Without industrial demands, renewable electricity may struggle to displace fossil fuels at scale. The two transitions now need to move together. The mitigation potential is substantial, but it should be understood as technical potential under specific assumptions, not an automatic forecast. In selected chemical subsectors, replacing fossil-based hydrogen with renewable hydrogen could reduce emission by more than 90%, avoiding over 630 million tons of carbon dioxide. In steel, expanding scrap-based electrical arc furnace production could cut crude steel emissions by nearly half by 2050 under an ambitious scenario combining circularities and capacity rationalization. The strategic message is that China has several deep decarbonization pathways: renewable hydrogen, scrap-based EAF steelmaking, material recycling, and low-carbon feedstocks. But deployment depends on clean power, infrastructure, cost reduction, standards, and industry restructuring. These pathways are powerful, but they require system-level implementation. Cost remain the central barriers for early green hydrogen deployment. Hydrogen-based DRI steelmaking is still significantly more expensive than conventional BF-BOF production. In chemicals, green ammonia and green methanol also face cost gaps compared with fossil-based alternatives. This does not mean this pathway should wait until they are fully cost competitively everywhere. It means early deployment should be targeted and strategic. Industry clusters with access to low-cost renewable electricity, stable demand, and infrastructure are the most promising starting points. Transitional solutions, hybrid pathways, low carbon products standards, and better carbon accounting can all help create early markets. The goal is to move from demonstration to deployment while avoiding premature lock-in to high cost or high carbon routes. Finally, let me turn to the 15th Five-Year Plan outlook. The 15th Five-Year Plan marks a potentially important governance shift. During last 5-year plan, climate governance was still strongly shaped by dual control of energy intensity and energy consumption. In the current 5-year plan, the direction is moving towards dual control of carbon intensity and total emissions, supported by provincial assessment mechanisms. The carbon intensity target is 70% reduction, while non-fossil energy is expected to reach 25% of total energy consumption. At the same time, energy intensity is no longer a primary headline target in the overarching plan. This reflects a shift from controlling energy into governing emissions outcomes, but there is also a caveat. Revised accounting methodologies complicate comparison with previous years. As carbon governance becomes more important, transparent accounting, provincial accountability, and implementation quality will become essential for policy credibility. The outlook for the 15th Five-Year Plan can be summarized in 6 points. First, the focus will shift from peaking emissions to achieving sustained reduction. Second, coal and oil are approaching structural turning points, with future demand growth increasingly met by non-fossil sources. Third, deep electrification and industry transformation will accelerate, especially in energy-intensive value chains. Fourth, system integration will become more important than capacity expansion because renewable utilization, flexibility, and reliability will determine real emissions outcome. Fifth, carbon governance will become a core economic management tool through accounting assessment and provincial accountabilities. Sixth, regional transformation and just transition will rise on the policy agenda, especially as coal-producing regions become renewable and low-carbon industry hubs. Let me close with 3 messages. First, China's emissions are approaching a structural plateau, but sustained reduction is not yet guaranteed. Second, the next phase of the transition will be defined by system integration, industry transformation, and carbon governance, not renewable capacity growth alone. Third, the 15th Five-Year Plan will be the first real test of whether China can translate clean energy leadership into durable emissions reductions, stronger energy security, and industry upgradings at scale. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion and your question.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for your very insightful presentation. And now we move into a short Q&A session with Kevin and the rest of Agora's research team to dive deep into some of the points or questions raised. Here I already have several, and the first question is on international collaboration, climate governance for Kevin. So the question is, the COP31 presidency has signaled that one of the central themes this year will be electrification, an area where China has significant capacity and policy experience. What priorities and messages should we expect from China on electrification at COP31? And where do you see scope for new international agreements or cooperation in this space?
If we look at China stands in terms of electrification, China's electrification rate has approached 30%, which is higher than many OECD countries. Meanwhile, the electrification rate for the industry sector, the next frontier of China's carbon emissions reduction, is also very close to national average because industry accounts for the majority of China's national electricity consumptions. When we look at the policy signal from the COP presidency, it has rightly identified electrification as a promising field for international engagement in the coming years. But meanwhile, if you look at how China may contribute to the global electrification agenda, I think one issue is very important. In addition to exporting its clean electricity-related equipment, China should also consider to summarize the experience and the lessons the country has gained during its electrification process. If those experience and lessons could be shared with the rest of the world, especially the global south. That will be very beneficial.
Thank you, Kevin. The second question I have here, what kind of reinforcement mechanisms are applied to provinces that fall short of their emission targets? And do you expect, do you expect the enforcement approach to change with China now having set explicit carbon reduction targets? That's a question regarding to energy intensive provinces.
If you look at how the targets are formulated in China's 5-year plan, more and more targets are issued as a guideline target instead of a legally binding one. However, for some of the key targets, for instance, for energy intensity and for the carbon intensity target, is very important for the province to follow, which especially for carbon intensity target is also being built into the assessment for framework for province in the coming 5 years. But meanwhile, more importantly, as China transition its governance framework from the dual control of energy intensity and total energy consumption to carbon intensity and total carbon emissions, it's rather important for the country to be prepared to control absolute amount of emissions in the coming 5 years, because once the country's emissions peaks in the coming year, China will enter the phase of achieving carbon neutrality, then on absolute cap on national emission as well as provincial and sector emissions become more essential. This is very important for China's coming 5-year plan.
Thank you, Kevin. And the next question is on just transition. China's transition away from a coal-heavy economy in certain regions will have large implications for employment. Does China have measures in place to deal with the loss of jobs in the fossil fuel sector?
If you look at where China stands in terms of just transition, this policy agenda actually has gained higher policy priorities, especially after Chinese President Xi Jinping announced China's intention to double down efforts on this field during his attendance of a United Nations conference. Meanwhile, across province, it's also very important to notice that on the one hand, while coal production keep rising, but the employment impact is significant because several million coal mining jobs have already disappeared in China's coal industry. Meanwhile, more and more jobs have been created in the renewable sector. The problem is there is geographic mismatch between those jobs. How to bridge the gap? This is not only a task by local government, but also need concerted efforts and central government coordination in this regard. Well, on the one hand, China has made progress, but on the other hand, more concrete work, more dedicated financial resources should be channeled by both central and local government to this specific agenda in the coming 5 years.
Thank you, Kevin. And we might not have time for all questions today, so I will pick the very last question from the our Q&A box. But for the For the questions we did answer, please feel free to reach out to our team. We're very happy to have further discussion with you. So the last question is on industry. China has just launched a 3-year action plan for decarbonizing industry. What is the significance of the plan, and which elements do you think are worth watching?
If we look at the significance of the plan, we should focus on which specific subsectors the 3-year plan have focused. And in addition, the 3-year prefix is also very important, because when we talk about 3 years, the government is serious in channeling tangible results and pay enough policy attention to move the agenda forward. This is quite different compared with a longer-term plan. So in this regard, we need to watch carefully what pilot project will be introduced, and also how this plan could be complemented with China's recent push of those net zero industry park, and also how this action plan might be integrated into the 5-year plan at the provincial level. These are all important issues that deserve continuous attention.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I could also add 1 cent to the answer. So the latest 3-year action plan, this policy is actually inconsistent with our findings in the report that industry decarbonization is entering a more challenging phase. Over the next 3 years, as China faces out the low efficiency industry capacity, and relatively they are the low-hanging fruit for emission reductions. The focus of industry decarbonization will increasingly shift towards deep industrial decarbonization, and the next stage will involve higher marginal abatement costs and require the deployment of technologies and achieve further emissions reduction. And I see my colleague Wenbo from industry team hands. Please.
Thank you, Zhou. Actually, if we look at the specific target requirements set for subsectors, as Kevin just mentioned, it is clear that we have a quite ambitious target for industry decarbonization. The question is, however, how to achieve this decarbonization target. For instance, it has set 40% of decarbonization target for certain subsectors, which makes the annual decomposition of annual task a quite demanding one. And at this stage, it would be a crucial task also for the subsectors to clarify what would be the path forwards, what would be the technical solutions that they have for achieving those demanding tasks. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Wenbo. Okay, so I'd like to invite everyone to join our next session. We now move into our panel discussion on a comparative view of China's energy transition. We will bring in perspectives from macro level analysis, peer organizations working on China data, power sector, and our Polish partners sharing insights on international cooperation opportunities with China. So now I'm handing over to our panel facilitator, Julia, and then our panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe. Thank you, Kevin, for this great and very rich presentation. And thank you to the audience for your questions. I love the discussion that is already going on now. And I can imagine that our external experts also cannot wait to join the discussion. So please come on stage. Professor Qi Ye, Chair Professor and Dean of the Society Hub at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mrs. Happy to have you here. Mrs. Lydia Wojtal, International Program Lead at Forum Energii, a partner think tank based in Poland. Welcome, Lydia.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Mrs. Belinda Schepe, China team lead at the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, CREA. Welcome, Belinda.
Thanks also for me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, great. And last but not least, Mrs. Wang Qian, Senior Advisor at our partner think tank, Regulatory Assistance Project, RAP.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I just mentioned the discussion is already going on. Very many questions on point have been asked and are also in the chat. Nonetheless, I would like to take a step back and start with you, Professor Qi. You are a globally recognized environmental scientist and policy expert. You have led research and writing on the annual review of low carbon development in China, among others. So you're really an expert of the Chinese energy and system and climate aspects. So how would you assess China's overall progress over the past years against the major energy and climate objectives of the 14th five-year plan? So what's your key take on this?
Well, thank you, Julia. I think the 14 five-year plan period was quite amazing in terms of achieving the target for energy transition, also for the carbon targets. But at the same time, we have to point out that there was a major challenge during the 14 five-year plan, which is the very rapid increase of the overall energy consumption. You know, back in 10 years ago, the 2015, 2016, when China was making this mid to long-term energy plan, and what was made very clear was to limit the overall energy consumption within 4 billion tons of coal equivalent. I mean, that's the unit by 2030. What happened is by last year, the end of last year, 2025, we saw that number have already been surpassed, exceeded 6 billion. And now last year, end of last year was a 6.17. 5 years earlier, and that I think that's what's a major challenge. The same time, what is even more challenging is the power generation. The power generation within this 5 years from 2020 to 2025, that increased 38%. 38%. That was quite amazing. Put these two together, it was very hard to achieve the energy energy intensity target. Right? So that's we saw that. What is the amazing is the overall carbon emission has stabilized during the 14th five-year plan. That was a big surprise. And I guess that's what Kevin was referring to. For the next 5-year plan, the 15th five-year plan, and the major task would be to governing the carbon rather than to achieve the carbon peak is governing the carbon target. Now I have a little bit different take on that, but we can discuss on that. So overall, I say I think the government and also the market has done a quite amazing job in balancing the energy meeting the energy demand, power demand at the same time to manage the carbon emissions target.
Yeah, thank you very much. Turning to you, Belinda, you're also a renowned expert on the Chinese energy system and climate transition, and your organization, Korea, also focuses highly on the importance of high-quality emission data. And the volumes we are discussing here are just huge. So from your research, what are the biggest challenges in accurately tracking China's emissions today?
Yeah, absolutely. And congratulations also to Agora for this report. I think I very much agree with Kevin's assessment earlier that it's about transparency and consistency of how emissions are measured and how they are reported. So we provide some monthly data on snapshots on energy and emission trends and also quarterly analysis. But this is in large part due because there isn't any coming officially, right? While there's some data that is published regularly in China, for example, on carbon intensity, as we discussed, the CO2 emissions per unit of GDP, there's always a huge delay when it comes to detailed emission inventories or energy statistics that come out years later. So that doesn't give us a very good picture. And this is what the gap that we're trying to fill with our work. But certainly, I think how it could be improved would be more timely publications of detailed emission inventories and clearer disclosure when it comes to revisions on strengthening transparency of that credibility. I think also in the next phase, as we're moving to not only controlling energy sector emissions, but overall sector emissions, there's a huge need to strengthen monitoring, reporting, and verification across sectors, especially in the industrial sectors. We discussed how this will be the next frontier, so this will be crucial. But really, I think what's worrying us is the credibility of the methodologies that China uses. So we have seen recently what seems to be a revision in the methodology of one of the key climate targets, the CO2 intensity target. And that is like a huge part of China's international commitments. So now this recent revision shows us, illustrates how methodological changes really matter and what kind of implications they can have, because it means that progress can be interpreted very differently. So I think there is a lot of opportunity to strengthen this and to strengthen the credibility of China's climate targets by giving very clear explanations of how these definition of targets is being defined in advance and for those not to be retroactively changed. So I would say, these are the main challenges, but there are obvious ways of how they could be addressed as China transitions into this new dual carbon system, but of controlling total emissions and not just intensity, that include, these kind of transparent methodologies, timely data disclosure, and then a more robust industrial MRV process to support the climate targets and make them more internationally credible again.
Yeah, thank you for this more general assessment on regarding the database for our findings. I would like to ask you a follow-up question, still looking back before we move ahead. Because Kevin already mentioned in the presentation the relevance of the development of emissions in the industry sector. Now, from your knowledge, what would you highlight as relevant developments in the industry sector over the past 5 years?
Yes, I think Kevin has outlined some really good takeaways there, and I think it is that is what's changing. Like we've seen a lot of progress in the energy sector, but in industry the picture is a lot more mixed, because we've seen significant emission reductions, for example, in the cement sector, also partly in the steel sector, but those are largely due to output reductions, not to an actual structural change in the way that the industry operates. And I think this is going to be the key challenge going forward, to not just cut outputs that will still remain important, but also to really tackle these deep decarbonization and electrification. So when we look, for example, in the steel sector, electrification has been very slow. China missed the target for 2025 to achieve 15% of production to come from electric arc furnaces. Instead, it's kind of stayed at 10% for over 5 years. So there's a lot of need to put in better incentives and policies for electric steel production to really take off. We have seen some recent policy changes trying to address that, but there is a lot of opportunity still. And I think one of the key challenges that we see is overcapacity in the sector. That's making it much harder to actually invest into this transition, and that's also putting a financial strain on the sector. Then the other one I would highlight, and that we also talked about, is the chemical sector. I think this is the sector we're most worried about because, as I said, in steel and cement, emissions are going down because the real estate sector is not doing well. But in the chemical sector, emissions are actually growing significantly. They have become the main driver of emissions growth, even though they're growing from a small base, but the growth is very fast, and they accounted for more than half of China's fossil fuel demand growth. And while, there's clear policies to curb industrial emissions from other sectors, for chemicals, there's a lot of government policies actually incentivizing a growth in especially coal chemicals. And that's really problematic because coal chemicals production is a lot more energy emission intensive than, for example, oil or gas chemicals production. And at the same time, this is a sector that's currently not covered under China's emission trading scheme, and there isn't a lot of policies in place for actual monitoring, reporting, and verification in this sector. So this will be really crucial going forward to also include chemicals in the sector, in the emission trading scheme, and to not just reduce industry output, but really kind of tackle the decarbonization in the sector and the electrification. And maybe to briefly address the question earlier about the most recent policy that came out this Monday, I think what stood out to me that was quite interesting is that there's a line in there that says that projects that fail to complete upgrades and these kind of new standards that are being introduced are to be phased out. And I think this will be really important to tackle the issues of overcapacity, both in industrial sectors. This also applies to the energy sector. So it will be really interesting to see how that affects China's still growing coal power fleet. But I think these are some good signals that we are seeing. But it will be a bumpy road, I think, for the next 5 years for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much for your assessment. I could go on and on the industry sector, of course, but maybe your reference to the coal to chemicals will be a segue to look ahead and come back to you, Professor Chi, with regards to what Kevin mentioned, that in the 15th five-year plan, there's a shift away from an energy intensity target more to carbon intensity. So what would in your view, what would the removal of the energy intensity target signal about China's evolving climate and energy governance? Again, at a more higher level.
There are two factors for moving from energy intensity to carbon intensity and the overall carbon emissions, right? The two targets. With the rapid increase of non-fossil fuel sector, wind and solar, nuclear and others, it doesn't really make sense to focus on the energy target anymore. At the end of the day, you want to reduce carbon, not to reduce energy use. Right? I think that's a very important reason. I think moving into the carbon target also because as I mentioned, this very rapid increase in demand and consumption for electricity. This is something came in as a surprise. Nobody actually expected this such a growth, such a rapid rate of growth in the power demand. And I guess that this has a lot to do with the worldwide increase the demand for AI and other digital technology and manufacturing equipment related to this. And this is a very rapid increase in power demand. Therefore, you need energy to produce the power. And as a matter of fact, in the last 5 years, during the 14th five-year plan, the power sector, power generation, grew faster than GDP. So the economic efficiency of power actually decreased over this period of time. So that's also make it more relevant to use the carbon target rather than the energy target. So I think this is moving that direction is very important. So if I make a suggestion, I think from now on, focusing on the overall carbon emission is a good idea, rather than focusing on the intensity target, right? The intensity target is still relevant, but more important target is the overall carbon emissions. So let's see what happens in the next 5-year plan, the 15th 5-year plan, because this is previously, I thought, I mean, many years ago, 10 years ago, I thought, our analysis would say, okay, 2025, by 2025, we'll get the carbon peak. But now, looking at this, considering this very rapid increase in power demand, I think it's still quite challenging. It's still quite challenging in the next 5-year plan to maintain this the carbon peak. That's why this is still quite it's not so easy. It's not so easy. And that's probably why the 15th 5-year plan, they still make this as a challenging target. So previously I thought it was quite conservative, but now I do agree this is still quite challenging to maintain the carbon target within, by 2030.
Thank you. Belinda, you wanted to come in with a tiny addition, because we have 2 other great experts here as well, which I would like to hand over the mic afterwards. So yeah, tiny addition on the issue of carbon intensity.
Yes, just two things very briefly on this. I think I agree with Professor Qi that the overall carbon control will be really important going forward, but I would like to highlight that the CO2 intensity target remains equally important, because the 65% reduction by 2030 compared to 2005 levels under the previous definition would have implied that China would have had to reduce emissions already by 2030. Whereas this new change in the methodology means that Chinese emissions could actually still grow until 2030. And the gap that we have seen over the last 5 years in terms of what has been reported is roughly 700 million tons a year. So these kind of changes in the methodology are really important to understand. And the carbon intensity target needs to be maintained alongside the total control target, because in essence is at the moment actually stronger than the total control target that the government has set for 2035. So I just wanted to add.
That's exactly what the government is doing right now, to emphasizing on both intensity target and also the overall emissions, right?
Yeah, thank you. Relevant addition from both of you, indeed. And now turning to one of the key drivers of reducing emissions, Xian, you are an expert on the clean energy transition in China. And Kevin, in his presentation, just emphasized that after the renewables expansion, now systems integration will become crucial. From your perspective, what are the key priorities for improving renewables integration during the term of the 15th five-year plan?
Thank you, Julia, for the question. Yes, in the past 10 years, renewable installations grew so fast in China, and China was able to maintain the curtailment really low because government required great companies to have guaranteed purchase of renewables. But during nowadays, when 60% of renewables are in the market, and it doesn't work anymore. So the priorities shall be moving to developing market rules to help integrate renewables. These market rules include, for example, moving all the pilot spot markets into fully operation, and also like increase the volume and frequency of interprovincial tradings at different at spot markets and mid and long-term markets. And also, for example, in the long-term markets, it also will continue financializing the physical long-term contracts that hinder regional economic dispatch. All of this will continue improving in the next 5 years. And also, Kevin talked a lot about flexibility. I think in the next 5 years, government will really focus on how to use the market mechanism to promote flexibility. Each region may have its tailored solutions to improve flexibility, but especially on the demand side, because all those vertical power plants, demand side response, V2G, these are really clean and low cost, flexible resources that can help balance the grid, and also they will reduce the needs for investment in some traditional storage or grid expansion or dispatchable generations. So, but all this flexibility, demand flexibility's value is not fully realized now in the market. So they will need a lot of price signals and market incentives to enable these new resources.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would now like to bring in Lydia. Lydia, we heard a lot of what's going on in China, and we, Agora, as an internationally operating organization, we always, look at, okay, what can different regions learn from each other. Now, from everything what you heard about China, how much of this reminds you of what's actually happening or has been happening in Poland, and what the big issues for the energy transition in Poland are right now?
Thank you very much, Julia, for the question, and thank you for the invitation. I think what is important is to realize that annual reports made by entities that are not necessarily the government provide an excellent basis to assess what is actually happening in the country. It provides this additional source of information, but also allows the international community to better understand what is happening. So in terms of what Forum Energy has been doing in the last 10 years, we actually have our 10th anniversary this year. We have been releasing these annual reports, well, annually. And with each year, we have, based on the information that we already had, but we have been also adding new features, new information, new kind of approaches. For example, 2022, we have quantified the data on the Polish spending of fossil fuel imports, and that became like the main, one of the main features of our annual reports, because this is so important for us to understand what our dependencies are and how much they cost us and what can we do about it. In 2025, so only last year, we have learned that, well, 2 years prior, 2023, we're actually next to China. Not something that we would normally look at, but it was in terms of emissions per unit of energy consumed. So we have been on the 5th place, China's on the 4th. Now it's shifted. We're on the 8th. China is on the 5th. It was in 2024. Again, something that has not come to, well, regular thinking when we talk about China and Poland. And finally, this year we have looked back at 2025 to find out, despite all the global disturbances and the growing awareness of the dangers of energy dependency, Poland's dependence on fossil fuels is still increasing, and so is the cost of this dependence. It rose to 46% from 29 a year before, and this dependence is mainly driven by crude oil. And also we are increasingly using natural gas due to rising demand in the power sector. So in that sense, Poland is surprisingly close to the dilemma of Chinese crossroads, because at the same time, we have the share of renewables growing, and available capacity exceeded 50% of for the first time in 2025. And half of the PV generation came from the prosumers. This basically shows how deep the transition has sunk into the social sphere, to something that people actually discuss on the street. And this contributed not only to improvements of air quality, because we used to burn, and we still do actually, quite a lot of coal for heating, but also it reduces fossil dependence and also creates more resistance to energy price shocks. And then coal. Well, coal is something, is one of the concerns that we share with China. But this generation in Poland has actually fallen in the last decade by 35%. And it will keep dropping according to the recently adopted governmental plans on that topic. So summarizing, I think that it is important to release those reports in a structured and orderly manner, allowing the data to come together, to be comparable, to actually find the new features that are important for the transition, because it allows not only to see what the challenges are, but actually to address them. So I think this is something that we share with Agora Energy China, and that will keep to be the basis of our cooperation on the international level.
Thank you, Lydia. I would like to come back to you, Xian, and bring in another cross-country reflection from the chat, because it relates to flexibility. There's a question on actually how the situation in China is with regards to in how far households, for example, are ready to flexibilize their electricity consumption, and that this is a challenge in Austria, for example, and the question is being asked whether this is, like also a similar challenge in China, or whether Chinese politics is dealing better with this.
For the households and users, usually the local governments control a lot the retail price. So to keep them affordable and stable for the residential customers is saying very important in China. So it means a lack of dynamic pricing signals for those residential customers to respond to the market situation. Like when renewables generates a lot of electricity, the residential customers actually do not have that incentive to use more green electricity. But like new forms of business model is developing in China. For example, a lot of aggregators are aggregating some residential customers with EV, and also like they could bid into the spot markets, or they could be directly controlled by the dispatch centers. So, for example, their heat pumps could be switched on and off according to the grid situation. But that's still emerging, like at the very early stage of development.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is probably a field to be watched, and also relates to the question of renewable system integration, right? So I would like to come to a closing question to all of you. If you were advising Chinese policymakers on one priority for the 15th five-year plan, what would it be? Professor Qi.
And I agree with Kevin that the industry sector now become the decarbonization frontier. Really, right now the pilot project for zero carbon industrial parks. This is a major effort, and the key of that is to use green power and to significantly increase the proportion of use of green power. This is probably a key element, and but now if I advise to the government, I would say let's make sure these pilot 52 of them pretty soon increase to 100. Make sure these pilots are really doing their jobs and utilizing green power, because it's not easy. It is not easy technically and also institutionally, and we need some certain incentive policy, and also at the same time to help these product owners to do that. They may have the willingness, but they may or may not have the capacity to do it. I think that would be a major point to watch. Right?
Thank you. Over to you, Belinda. And can I combine it with a second question? So what would be your recommendation, and which indicator would you be watching most closely by 2030 to judge whether China's transition remains on track, as this is one of your organization's key areas?
Yeah, so hard, so many to choose from, right? But I would say, in terms of recommendation, the main one is really to advance power market reform and to really send very clear signals to especially the coal industry that we're getting into a period of time where we're really looking at phase down. China's still building new coal power plants every year. Last year, we've seen a record high in the last 10 years. But at the same time, utilization is going down, and there's already an abundance of clean energy capacity, which is being curtailed. Also, as Xuan was saying, we're seeing huge curtailment in the first quarter of this year in solar, wind, and even hydro. So I think it's really about like getting this power market reform right, and really putting in place the right incentives and cut some of these long-term power purchase agreement with coal power plants that keep these locked in and that don't really unleash the flexibility and the potential that China has with this vast clean energy capacity. And in terms of the indicators that I would measure, I think it would be really like, yeah, seeing a clear reduction in coal consumption, also seeing a clear reduction in the power sector emissions. And of course, ideally, the main indicator that we would be looking at is to what extent the CO2 intensity target is still being met. And whether that's being met because the methodology has changed or because we have seen actual emission reductions across the sectors.
Thank you. Oh, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we hear you fine.
Okay. Just got a signal that the power of my headphones is not on 100% anymore. Okay, just give me a signal if if the connection is bad. Yeah, thank you. And this is actually what in your answer, Belinda, it is a link to your answer, Professor Qi, as well, right? So getting the zero carbon industrial hubs right related to and for them to be powered with renewables. Turning to you, Sheng, what would you advise Chinese policymakers as one priority for the 15th five-year plan?
I think one important issue is to ensure renewable energy and also demand flexibilities to be treated equally in any market segment, like capacity market, mid-long term, and spot markets. And this not only needs to develop new market rules to facilitate renewable integration, but also we need to revise the old rules that unfairly favor like fossil fuels. For example, capacity payments, and also some mid and long-term like contracts that favor traditional power plants. And make sure that renewables are really valued in power planning, in market, and in compensation, a great operation, and all those things are not isolated, but they have to move like in parallel.
Yeah, thank you. And now finally to you, Lydia, and may I also combine it with one question, like in your area of one key area of your expertise, international collaboration. So if you would relate this to the area of international collaboration, where would you also see the greatest opportunities for international cooperation in the next 5 years?
Starting from the maybe advice on the internal policy, I think coming from the data-oriented organization, and also I do have extensive governmental and climate negotiating background, and I know that nothing builds or destroys trust more than the shifting baseline for accounting of targets. I think this is something that everybody is looking towards, because this is the main thing that basically creates the credibility of the basis of the credibility for our cooperation. So my personal advice would be to make sure that the accounting rules, that's something that both Belinda and Kevin mentioned, accounting transparency of data is done right and forms a solid basis for anything that happens later on in China. I think in sense of international cooperation, someone in the comments mentioned electrification, and we have shortly discussed it, but I think this topic is gaining actually a lot of attention due to COP, but I think also because of the necessity to think about solutions going beyond fossil fuels dependency, and electrification is one of these important features that can actually create a new paradigm. And if we have the right accounting, if we have the right data coming from countries on how much they electrify, what does it entail, what kind of energy sources come into play for that electrification, that would make a huge change if China showed the way on how this is best done. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely agree. Now we're coming to an end of this panel discussion. Thank you all for this very rich discussion, these insights on many different levels. I think it was amazing to bring together the expertise from different perspectives here to our discussion.